Hello everyone, it's Jin'taan here today with Kinera, who is a member of and the military director for Brave Newbies, which is, as the name suggests, a group with a large amount of new players inside of it. What can you tell us about the Alliance, and more specifically, what are the constraints of working with newer players in fleets?
Yeah, so we're I guess you'd say it's a decently sized alliance, but there's a few corps in the alliance, but our main corp is Brave Newbies, and so we have quite an, well, we have basically no recruitment requirements, and as such, we have a lot of lower skill, but also a lot of kind of casual players who maybe don't play every single day and don't take the game quite as seriously as some others do. So as a result, despite we have like quite large on paper numbers, our fleets can be kind of small, I guess, for that size, and a lot of our fleets are, the percentage of the fleet that you get in the actual doctrine that you're looking for is going to be lower than a lot of other alliances. Which is obviously, I guess, one of the constraints of working with newer players, and it's something that obviously we are aware of. So we always try and have fits and stuff for our newer players to fly that maybe if they can't fly the full doctrine fit, you have support frigates and you have E-War and you have the new Defender missile launchers are an excellent role that newer players can fill. Like even an alpha player can fill that, and it's super helpful on larger fleets. So yeah, it's one of those things I guess that you have to be aware of. And then obviously, just when we're designing new doctrines and new fleet comps, you're kind of wondering, can not just can my dudes afford this? It's also can my dudes fly this? So we try and look at having things like a nice progression in our skill training, which we used to have with a lovely kind of Talwars, Caracals, Jackdaws, nice line. But then CCP went and nerfed Caracals, so that's probably going to have to change. But it's that kind of stuff that we try and keep in mind when we're designing fleet comps, not just what is the best ship I can put my guys in.
You actually made an interesting point there about alpha players. Do you use alpha players within your doctrine design?
Yeah, we always try and account for them. So obviously, alpha players are quite limited in what they can fly, but there's usually so we usually try and have at least one or two fits for every race. In larger fights, such as battleship and even battlecruiser fights, as I mentioned, dick destroyers are also great. But in cruiser doctrines, we have logi fits for alphas of the relevant races, and often E-war cruisers as well for alphas can work quite well. So it is something that we do keep in mind when coming up with our doctrine designs, because we have no recruitment requirements and we want everyone to be involved in the fleets, even if not everyone is involved in the sort of key roles like doctrine DPS or logi.
That's actually kind of interesting, especially when you look at things like caracal fleets, because you wouldn't be able to tell who is an alpha and who isn't an alpha. So does that, have an impact on how you evaluate the power of your fleet at the time?
Not the fleet as a whole, because I always generally assume that we have a slightly lower SP, average SP, than guys we're fighting against. So it's just a sort of a general factor. But you can usually identify, the newer players and the alpha players because they'll be in, if it is a Caracal fleet, sure, but, not every alpha is a Caldari. So they'll be in often off racial ships and more niche roles. But I guess the key for us is to make sure that there are these roles that they can fill and be useful in the fleet.
Ah, that's really interesting. So how long have you been working with Brave?
I'm one of those guys who's like joined Brave as casual kind of Eve player and then just kind of sort of never left. I started, I was around when Brave was big the first time, but not really playing Eve much, and I started playing quite heavily. Uh, Ironically, just after Brave completely fail skated and died and moved back to low sec, and we basically lost all of our FC talent and a lot of our leadership talent. So there was this kind of void in content, and my feeling was, if I want content, then I need to go out and create it myself. And I just stepped up. I started running roams, and this was like really small, like 10 to 20 dudes, because that was about all we could form at the time. And I just started running fleets. We were in faction warfare at the time, so it was a lot of frigate and destroyer fleets and sometimes cruiser fleets. So lots of cheap stuff, which is really good for a starting FC because there's no pressure when if you want to whelp and that kind of stuff. So that's how I started out, just because nobody else was doing it, basically. I guess as Brave has sort of regrown after that failscade, we've gone from, I remember the first time we tried getting caps together when I was FCing, and we got like 3 dudes, and now we can form, a few more than 3 dudes. Not exactly a huge cap group, but it's better, and where our fleets are getting larger, we've gone from forming 20 to forming 100 plus for regular on the for stratops. So, and as that happened, we increased our doctrines. We moved from cruisers up to battle cruisers up to battleships, and I moved from FCing cruisers up to FCing battle cruisers up to FCing battleships, and that's kind of how I developed as an FC.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So it sounds kind of like you grew alongside Brave during their regrowth period.
Yeah, definitely. I think it was just while I was quite active, so just by learning the doctrines, you get quite familiar with them because, as I said, we're quite SP limited. So once we adopt one doctrine, tend to be quite committed to it. So just the Hurricane, which has been our workhorse for a good year plus now, ever since we moved back to nullsec, and we're still rocking a couple of other doctrines that we've had for a long time. And I think that's good because it makes sure that, everyone can kind of train into these doctrines, but our longer term players have the SP to train into all the niche roles that we need for the doctrines and then start looking at bigger ships.
All right, so what keeps you FCing after all this time?
Well, obviously winning is nice. I'm quite competitive, so I do like to win. But I think it's more the challenge of FCing. There's a lot to think about, I find, in FCing. I find it much more interesting, and also the meta game around it than just sort of undocking in my ship and following orders. I'm not great at following orders. I like to be the one sort of giving the orders, or at least helping give the orders. So I guess that's what keeps me involved in FCing. And I think, yeah, it's what keeps me involved in EVE, because FCing is what I love about EVE. And I haven't really found another game where you can be involved in sort of leading a group, such a large group, with so many factors at play and so much to think about.
That's actually pretty much, the reason I stay in EVE, so that's great to hear. Would you say you're a natural leader then? Or is this something that only kind of comes out in EVE?
I don't know. I wouldn't like to say I'm a natural leader. I think my ego is maybe not backing that up well enough, because definitely when I started FCing, I was very shy about it. It took me ages just to speak up on comms. So it was something that I think as I developed in FCing, I think my leadership style also developed in FCing. And like, I know that FCing in EVE has helped me with leadership skills in real life, which is kind of a funny thing. It's not something I'd put on a CV or anything, but it is definitely something that I've noticed.
All right. And earlier you talked about how Brave UV's, fights, and more specifically about how you have a lot of lower skilled players. How do you think affects your style of FCing? Are do you put more emphasis on the utility of having E-War from those newer pilots? Are you more aggressive because of that? Are you more defensive because of that? How do the people you work with influence what you do?
Well, I think that I tend to assume that if it was just a mirror matchup, like equal numbers, equal fleets, that my fleet would be worse off, because I always assume that I have a lower average both SP level and generally a lower level of actual pilot skill. A lot of our guys are less experienced in flying their ships than people from other alliances. So I tend to assume that that is the case, and the mirror matchup won't go my way. So I change things before I undock to make sure that I have at least what I feel to be a sufficient advantage. So whether that's doing things like refitting ships to, E-War mid slots, or just kind of, picking the right doctrine even, is key. So it makes me a little bit more conservative in the fights that I do take, because I like to sort of feel that those factors are in place.
So, what would you say your biggest strength as an FC is then?
I would say, because I started out FCing in faction warfare, and a lot of that is sort of complex warfare, where you're trying to take one system, but you have multiple complexes in the system, and you need to control generally the majority of these complexes, and they're different sizes, so you have different ships. So it's a lot of sort of running and gunning warfare, where you often have your fleet split up over multiple plexes, and you're sort of running around and reacting constantly. It's a little bit like in warfare, I guess, in that factor. So there's a lot of information coming in there. So I think because I started out like that and then moved obviously onto doing Intosis stuff, that I'm quite good at managing information flow and kind of, we have a very decent recon group in Brave, and then they keep me well fed on information if I'm running the fleets. So I think I'm quite good at managing that, but also pre-planning. As I said, I like to try and put things in place before I undock to make sure that we can have a bit of an advantage in the fight. And I think I'm quite good at sort of simming out the engagement in my head, if you will, and then kind of evaluating, how well this could go for me, how well this might not go for me, and figuring out how I want to approach the fight, whether I want to be going in at range, at zero, whether I track better, so I want to be closer, or I want to really kind of stay at range and maximize my own tracking because I have heavier damage dealing ships. And that kind of play back and forth, I think I'm quite good at doing out in my head.
That's very interesting, something you said there, talking about identifying your own, way to victory. Is there any kind of techniques that you use to help with that, like mentally? Are there any shortcuts that you can give to people?
I think, to be honest, it just comes with familiarity with the game. I mean, you have to learn both what your doctrine can do, which is, relatively easy if you fly it a lot, but you have to be familiar with what the hostile fleet is capable of. Obviously the basics. There's big ships and there's small ships, and small ships try and get under guns, and big ships try and stay at range and hit hard as the 30-second. But there's a lot of more nuance to it than that, and it's kind of understanding where your doctrine fits in versus the enemy doctrine and anything else that's on grid. So to be honest, I think it just comes with experience.
Yeah, knowing what kind of advantages you have over the enemy.
Yeah, exactly, and kind of knowing how the enemy FC also might act is helpful, especially if you have a spy on comms or something. But nobody here is that dishonorable, I'm sure.
Well, on another note, what would you say your biggest weakness as an FC is?
Honestly, I'm terrible at manual piloting. So as an anchor, I always used to hate flying sort of fast kitey fleets. I mean, caracals are okay, but we used to have a harpy doctrine that was really fast, and I could never anchor that thing because my manual piloting was just terrible. So I would always get someone else to anchor, and I would just target call and fleet warp and do that kind of stuff. Which is nice because it sort of shares the FC load out a bit. But yeah, definitely, I can't kite is basically how it is.
So that's kind of
I guess
interesting. So you're able to, mitigate your weaknesses by bringing other people in. Do you think that's helped to train up other FCs as you FC'd yourself?
yeah, definitely. I mean, I think we always we're running strat ops in Brave, we always try and have I'm sure everyone else does it as well, but we try and have a secondary and a tertiary FC, both for headshots, but also because you can have one guy anchoring, and if he's 100% focused on anchoring, he's a much stronger anchor than if he's trying to have both anchor and target call and manage all of the other information that's coming in. So we find that generally having one person focusing more on one aspect, so long as the FCs are able to work well as a team together, it works out better than you just kind of relying on one Jesus FC to carry the day. I suppose it is definitely, there's a factor where you have to be confident in the ability of the people you're with. If you're FCing and you're not confident with the other people, then yeah, you are going to want to take on too much yourself. And I guess that's another one of my weaknesses, in that I have the tendency sometimes to try and over micromanage my fleet, especially when you have large fleet with multiple components and you're trying to, manage both subcaps and caps and maybe some other, like a secondary fleet if you have an E-War wing or something, and trying to over micromanage that as a single FC. It doesn't always work. I mean, yeah, I'm a terrible micromanager. Was always terrible at real-time strategies and stuff. So it's more something that you have to trust your fellow FCs and delegate the jobs. But obviously that comes with both training them up that they're able to do that well.
So, what was the last lesson you learned as an FC? What was the last mistake you made, and what have you learned from it?
Well, the last mistake I made was pretty recent, I guess. There was that big fight going on in Olga over an anchoring Keepstar, and well, NCPL showed up to defend it, and Goons and some other guys Project Mayhem snuffed out. I should say, well, the Imperium, I guess, is what they're going for. Showed up to kill it. I decided last minute, just take a small group down. We had something like 20 jackdaws, so we were just sort of screwing around on the edge. Horde showed up. They had a medium-sized hurricane fleet, so we decided that we would go in for them. We landed on them at 0. Command Desi jumped their fleet right in half and jumped them away from their logi. And we were kind of getting a few frags there because they had no logi and we were at 0, so their hurricanes couldn't track us at all. But I sort of tunnel visioned a bit, so I didn't notice the other fleet burning, the other half of the fleet, burning the 100-kilometer distance back over to us. I knew they were coming, but I tunnel visioned hard and I didn't see that they had arrived. And then, suddenly all of my jackdaws started dying and all of their logi had arrived, so we weren't killing anything. And it went suddenly from being a situation where, you're just sort of slowly burning through these hurricanes who can't scratch you, and then you have no jackdaws left and you have to disengage. So, tunnel visioning is one of the sort of really common mistakes. Like I even find that a lot of RFCs make and a lot of, new FCs make. So it was just something that I flagged up for myself, be a bit more to maintain the overview of the grid a bit better.
Do you think you can break down what tunnel visioning is a bit more for the listeners?
Yeah, sure. So tunnel visioning is basically when you're FCing, obviously there's a lot going on and you focus too hard on only one aspect. So in this case, it was me focusing too hard on killing the members of the Hurricane fleet that we had separated, that I didn't maintain my sort of overall awareness that you need to maintain. So I didn't see the other pieces moving around on the grid, so I didn't see the other half of the fleet returning. And so tunnel visioning is essentially when you focus too hard on one thing and you lose your overall awareness of the strategic or the tactical situation on grid, I guess.
What's one specific tip you would give to a new FC or someone who is just learning into the role? Maybe something that you wish someone had told you when you were learning to FC.
I think that a lot of new FCs focus quite hard on the actual FCing, which is good. Obviously, that's what you want them to do. Things like anchoring and which targets to call. But they think less, because I find that a lot of fights, especially for new FCs, they'll undock and they'll take fights that they really had no chance of winning, and that they should have sort of taken a little bit longer to plan out how they were going to take the fight in advance. So I think that the tip I would give is definitely to plan what you're going to do before you leave. Obviously, if you're roaming, you just kind of want a well-rounded general fleet. But a lot of the PvP that we do is, because we're like content central, we get a lot of roaming gangs coming to us, so it's reacting to them. So I would, tell my FCs to make sure that they're picking the right doctrine from their doctrine stable, and make sure that then they flesh out the fleet well enough. They don't just go, max DPS, max logi. They make sure that they get the webs that they need or the tackle that they need to actually win the fight, and then consider that there's smaller things that you can then consider, like, refitting. Say you're fighting a kitey fleet and you bring an armor fleet, maybe you can fit some damps or some disruptors or some relevant E-wars so that you can have a bit more of an edge in the fight.
All right, so what doctrine are you going to be talking about?
I'm going to be talking about our Maelstrom doctrine, which is called Alpha Fleet, because I guess that's always what it's been called. I think it was CFC who came up with the fleet concept and called it that, so we've just kept the name in the interest of tradition. Interestingly, actually, when Alphas came out, there was quite a lot of people who wanted to change the name because they thought it would be confusing for Alphas. They would think, oh, Alpha Fleet, is this a fleet concept designed for me? When, no, Alphas can't fly Maelstroms, unfortunately. No.
So, what is the most defining aspect of the Alpha Fleet? I think I can guess from the name.
Yeah, the name kind of gives it away. It's surprisingly enough, it's the Alpha. The Maelstrom it's a shield battleship, so you have all those lows for damage mods, and you get a pretty huge Alpha strike, which I guess if those people aren't super familiar, Alpha is basically your volley strike. So rather than your sustained DPS, it's just the damage you do in a single shot. And I guess the key reason why Alpha is so popular and so in the meta at the minute is that it doesn't care about your logi numbers. If you have what we call critical mass, you have enough Maelstroms to Alpha a ship in one shot, then no matter how many Logi the opposing side has, they're not going to catch reps if you can kill them in one shot, which is great for us because, oftentimes we're fighting without cap superiority, so opposing fleets will bring triage and they'll drop 3 or 4 triage, and if it was just a conventional DPS doctrine, there's a high chance we wouldn't be able to get any kills. But with an alpha fleet, you can volley through and still get those kills.
What's something an individual pilot can contribute to the success of an alpha fleet?
Well, an alpha fleet, it kind of relies on two things. So it relies on the alpha being relatively synced, and that's a function of both the target caller, and there's a couple of different styles you can take to target call, and also the actual, the damage pilot's just a minor point, is just kind of being on call and shooting the targets at the right moment to ensure that you get that sort of synced alpha strike in order to volley through. Because otherwise you're just running DPS, and if you don't sync the alpha, then you may as well not have an alpha doctrine. So that's just a little tip for DPS pilots. But there's a lot of smaller roles that an alpha fleet needs to work well on grid. You need some strong dictors is really helpful, because a lot of times you're fighting against sig tanking fleets that will try and get on top of you. So doing things like placing stop bubbles to stop that. And competent anti-bomber, because of the alpha fleet is a shield battleship fleet, it has a huge sig radius, and it's really takes a lot of damage from bombs. So having pilots who are in anti-bomber ships and know how to use an anti-bomber ship or a defender launcher is really useful.
So it sounds like there's a lot of moving parts to this doctrine. What support does this doctrine use, and why does it use that support in particular?
So the key support for an alpha fleet is webs. Webs. If you run out of webs, you will stop killing things in a lot of cases. The main reason for this is that large artillery has really quite poor tracking. So you really need the webs in order to apply. So you're going to be bringing some Hugens, mainly because they have the most long-ranged webs, but they're quite squishy. So you'll often bring a few Lokis alongside the Hugens in case your Hugens just start dying. And it's really key that your Logi knows to keep the webs alive. So it's doing things like making sure that the webbing ships are watch listed, even if one web ship starts dying, you can get Logi to start pre-repping other web ships, because you really, 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 you need to keep those webs alive if you want to apply to anything that's not a battleship. The other parts of the fleet is obviously Logi. Because as we have somewhat lower numbers, and we tend to try and just push as many dudes into Maelstroms as possible, so we'll just drop a couple triage so that we don't have to stick 20 dudes in T2 Logi. But if you're trying to be a bit more mobile, they can also work with standard T2 Logi, Bazis, semis. And obviously, as we have a lot of new guys, we usually have a pretty substantial T1 Logi wing, which is great, because if something catches reps, it's really gonna hold, because the T1 Logi will rep it right back up. They're super squishy, and if you shoot them, they're gonna pop it. But if they're there, if you catch, you're probably gonna hold, because the T1 Logi bros are usually pretty on point. And then obviously, like I said previously, having competent anti-bomber is also important, because you're looking at a fleet that is a really appetizing target for a competent bomber FC. So having things like defender launchers is the current way we do it. Test has a Jackdaw. They'll often use a Jackdaw support fleet with their Maelstroms. We tend to try and use our newer players in destroyers with defender launchers. And then also things like fast tackle and well-placed hick bubbles are also really important for anti-bomber.
There's a point there you made about how using triage means that you can save numbers for your main fleet, and that's important to take into consideration with an alpha fleet, as having a critical mass of say 50 and having 50 dudes means that if you lose one guy, that can be pretty damaging. So do you think that having the maximum amount of possible dudes in Maelstroms is the key to this doctrine? Or are there reasons why you'd use T2 logistics over triage in certain circumstances?
I think in 90% of the times, just having max Maelstroms is generally the aim here, especially because our our number of Maelstrom pilots is a bit more limited, and a lot of our T2 Logi pilots are also Maelstrom pilots, so we try and get as many Maelstroms in a fleet as we can. That said, in other, that's triage is quite limited. Obviously, it ties you down. You're not very mobile. So if you're in a fight where once you commit that triage to the grid, you can maybe ping once, and then you're committed again, and then you have no Logi, and you're also quite vulnerable. So we always try and have a few T2 Logi in case you get hot dropped while traveling or something like that. But definitely, I think using the triage and getting as many Maelstroms as possible in the fleet is the way that we prefer to fly them.
So let's talk the ranges of this doctrine. What's its engagement profile? You talked about how kind of static it is. Obviously, range is going to be quite important.
Yes, so obviously, as I said, it tracks quite poorly. So what you really don't want to be is you don't want to be too close, because then you're going to have real trouble applying your damage. In general, the golden zone for a Maelstrom is 35 to 45 kilometers. But you definitely don't want to be any closer than 20 to 30. And once you sort of go beyond 50 or 60 kilometers, your damage starts to fall off. So sort of that 30 to 50 zone is the ideal place for you to be. This is with short range ammo, obviously, and you're trying to use short range ammo because you want to get the most alpha possible out of your Maelstroms. They can also they can engage at a longer range with the medium range and even the long range ammo. The medium range is also nice because it gives you a tracking bonus. And with the medium range ammo, you can engage at sort of, up to 80, 90 kilometers, which is nice for shooting sort of more kitey bullshit doctrines. But definitely your main aim and how you'll generally approach a fight is to get into that 30 to 50 kilometer golden zone with your close range ammo to get the most alpha possible.
How do you stay in that range, considering you are so static?
Yeah, and that's the real struggle. So part of it is obviously trying to be set up or trying to be the one who warps in at the correct range. But the other tactic you can use is you can really spread your fleet out a bit. So if you have a large enough fleet and you have the whole fleet orbiting the FC in a bowl of 20 to 30 kilometers radius, then even if the enemy fleet is on top of half the fleet, the other half of the fleet is at 30, 40 kilometers away and are still alphaing perfectly. And this is also quite a good anti-bomber tactic because it makes you spread out so you take less bomb damage. But it's also good for maintaining the range and the damage application. The other option is to just sort of, if you're fighting a slower doctrine, you can, I'm not going to say kite, but you can MWD fit and pull range semi-decently well. But this is more in a smaller engagement. With a large fleet, you definitely want to just sort of stick static on your triage and spread the fleet out.
You talked a little bit about how you wanted to make sure that you were the person who walked in at the right ranges. So how do you actually decide that, and more importantly, how do you engage with the doctrine? Are you trying to be the one to go in and make the first move, or do you want to force your opponents to kind of react to you already being set up?
I think that definitely because the battleships are quite slow, and if you have the numbers to just sort of get set up and get your large 20, 30 kilometer bowl of battleships set up, then that's the way you want to play it. You don't want to be sort of warping in a blob and then have whatever T3Cs warp in on you at 0. But obviously in other scenarios, it really just depends on what you're fighting against and how many guys you have. If you're limited in numbers, maybe you barely have critical mass, then obviously the bowling up strategy doesn't work because half your fleet isn't applying super well. So then you want to have the guys maybe anchored a little bit closer on the FC, so the FC can manage range a bit better, and you can try and use your webs to slow the other fleet down a bit. But it's a factor of what you're engaging against, and obviously it's often comes whether who's doing the warping in and who's already set up. It comes down to the fight. If you're defending, often you're already set up. The attackers will come in, but it really just depends on how the fight evolves.
Do you feel like the doctrine works better when you're attacking something or when you're defending something?
I think it works well either way. It obviously it's an alpha doctrine, so you're always going to get kills, which I guess is nice when you're attacking because you may not be able to hold the grid and win the objective, but you can often just come out as positive anyway, which is kind of nice. But I think it works well either way. Either attacking or defending, it doesn't really matter. You can play it either way. But obviously, with your defending, you do have that advantage of being able to set your guys up properly.
What type of fleets does this doctrine really do well against?
It does quite well against other battleships because obviously then application isn't a factor. So you hit hard and you can usually alpha as long as you have critical mass. Which is also quite nice against faction battleships because they're very tanky, but if you're alphaing through and it makes it, you trade very ISK efficiently for one thing. It does extremely well against battle cruisers because they both have the high sig and the low tank that you can just kind of pop right through them so long as you have enough webs. And that's generally what it does well against. It's heavy hitting, but it suffers from application. You can use it against T3Cs, but once you get down to the sort of cruiser-sized fleets, you really have problems with tracking and with application on the smaller SIG cruisers once they get on top of you.
How does it do against more kitey doctrines, like, say, the Cerberus?
Um, if you have enough, it does pretty well against the Cerberus because obviously, as I said, it can engage out to 90 kilometers with medium range ammo, which is tracking bonused, and then even further with long range ammo. But you do have trouble if the Serbs are sort of outside your web range. You can have a bit of trouble applying. But generally, if you can, unless the Serbs are like super far out, as long as you have info links in fleet and can lock far enough, then you are usually able to pop them off. And because you're quite tanky, and if you have your triage, the Serbs will often struggle to get kills unless they're alphaing through.
So you've talked about some of the doctrines that it doesn't do particularly well against, particularly AHACs and bombers. Is there anything else it's weak against?
It's weak against a couple of things. It's quite weak against E-War because you don't have any sort of mid slots for utility in that sense. So, fighting PL recently, they were bringing autocannon Macarials, and what they would do is they would fit 3 tracking disruptors in their mid slots of their armor autocannon Macarials. So obviously their autocannon we have a longer range, so we would come in at range and try and alpha them while staying out of range of their autocannon kill zone. And the idea is there that we try and alpha through, but then they were triple with their tracking disruptors. They were completely not damping us out, but completely disrupting our guns. So we weren't getting the application that we needed to alpha. So I thought that was a really interesting way of countering the doctrine and countering some of the range advantage that the doctrine had in that matchup. But in general, yeah, its 2 fundamental weaknesses are always going to be SIG tanking cruisers at close range and bombers.
Are there any other tips or tricks you've found that you can use with this fleet to kind of lead to success?
I think that one thing that I haven't really mentioned, I briefly mentioned syncing alpha, but as an FC, your target calling, obviously if you have a lot of dudes in fleet, you can kind of broadcast a target and rely on everyone to lock and fire, because everyone should have roughly a similar lock time and hopefully similar reaction times, unless they're asleep at the PC. You can rely on them to sort of semi-automatically sync the alpha. But when you're sort of on the edge of having critical mass, and you really need that ship to die before reps can land, what we'll often do in our fleets is we'll do a countdown. So we'll count down, lock the target up, do 3, 2, 1, and everyone fires simultaneously. And that way you can ensure that you can punch through before reps have a chance to land. And often, even if the target is getting pre-reps, you can punch through that way. Now, the downside of that is obviously that it completely slows down the rate at which you can kill ships. So it's not great in terms of, in a larger fight, you're going to probably lose critical mass faster than the other guy if you're doing that and he's just firing on lock. But if you're kind of on the edge of being able to alpha, using a countdown and using a countdown efficiently is one of the key tricks that we would use. Because especially on this point, this is quite controversial because I remember hearing Villy talk about Maelstroms, and Villy's one of the lead FCs of Test, and he's been FCing Maelstroms for quite a long time, which is a bit of an understatement. And he would say never use a countdown because the size of the fleets that he would run Maelstroms with, it's never needed, and it will just slow down your rate of fire. And then it becomes more on the FC to have a good rhythm in his target calling. But for us, because we're so close to that critical mass a lot of times, where you're just kind of on the edge of alphaing and not alphaing, we would often try and use a countdown.
All right, and conversely, are there any tips or tricks people have used to fight you other than the whole E-War stuff?
To generally just get at 0, kill webs. If a Maelstrom fleet has no webs, then it really can't apply. I mean, almost even on battleships at 0. If you can apply at a close range and have decent tracking, and you can get on top of the Maelstrom fleets, that's basically killing Maelstroms 101. I guess the other option is using range, but again, I sort of feel like at range the Maelstrom can still apply, but it does struggle with extremely long ranges. It's limited a little bit by lock range. Without links, it can only lock to 90 kilometers. So, even if you have info links, if your kite fleet is super far out, then the Maelstroms will struggle to hit it and damage it.
All right, well, thank you so much for your time. I hope to see you in the field again soon. Considering we live so close together, I'm pretty sure I will. Do you have any shout-outs before you go?
Yeah, I'll give a shout out to all the guys in Proto Social Club, number 1 Sig and Brave, and to all the guys on the FC team who, are running fleets and keeping us busy with content.
All right, and with that, we'll be signing off. Fly smart.